The period of the 6th to the 8th century in British history begins with the emergence of kingdoms for the first time since the fall of Rome. It ends, depending on how you want to split history up, with either the Mercian supremacy, where one of these kingdoms became dominant over all others, or with Viking settlement and invasion of the 9th century, which crippled these kingdoms and forever changed the way that government in Britain would be done. This period can be characterised by its multipolar nature. There were many kingdoms at roughly similar levels of importance and influence. This historical period has been called the Heptarchy, meaning 7 rule, implying that there were 7 kingdoms of roughly equal strength at this time. Those are, usually, Kent, Essex, Northumbria, East Anglia, Wessex, Mercia and Sussex. But this is oversimplistic, as there were more kingdoms around at the same time. Middlesex, Lindsey, Bernicia and Deira, to list some Anglo-Saxon examples, but also Celtic kingdoms like Elmet and Dumnonia. There were always more than 7 kingdoms in Britain in this period. In this video, I want to outline how Anglo-Saxon kingdoms before the Vikings were operated. This involves us discussing kings, kingdoms, and how people saw and understood the role of government in the Anglo-Saxon period. It involves us coming face to face with what is a very different time, and very different challenges which were confronted in very interesting ways. In Old English, the word for an Anglo-Saxon king was Kuninga. Kun meaning people, and Inga meaning originating from or son of. A Kuninga is the representation of the people and springs from them, as a son does from his parents. This is shown by how kings are titled. King Offa of Mercia is written in Old English as Offa Mirchna Kuninga, and in Latin as Offa Rex Merciorum. Both of these mean Offa, king of the Mercians, not Offa, king of Mercia. This is because an Anglo-Saxon king was not the lord of the soil, but the leader of his people. This sounds like an unimportant and uninteresting difference, but it meant that the owning of land was a private matter. A king owned his own land, but this wasn't relevant to his role as a king. Other people in the kingdom owned land as well. Their ownership of this land wasn't connected to serving the king. Instead, the role of king emphasised that he had rights over people, and in turn had obligations to them. The king's right was to take tax. He had his extended family, men in his service, and other servants besides. These people would need to be fed, clothed, and otherwise provided for. Taxes would be taken to do this, mostly food, but it could also be handicraft products, clothes, tools, jewellery, or maybe unprocessed resources for things to be made from, ores, leather, and wool. In turn, the king's job was to protect people and their property. This could be major protection, like from invasion, but more often than not it was minor protection. He issued laws for people to follow and solved legal disputes when these laws were broken. He dispensed punishment to criminals, taking fines and issuing judgments of outlawry, or the death penalty where relevant. The role of a king was to inspire the people's confidence that all of their possessions, land, cattle, and other objects, were protected under his rule. Before we talk about other things, we'll talk briefly of the comitatus. I briefly mentioned men that the king had in his service earlier. There's no specific Old English word for the followers of the king, something which we might consider a king's court. Tacitus, writing of Germanic people in the 1st century BC, names the followers of a Germanic king a comitatus, a Latin word which means a retinue or company. This is the term that academics prefer when referring to an Anglo-Saxon king's followers. In Beowulf, Hrothgar's men are referred to as a drut, a term which means army. Another useful term could be warband. The comitatus mainly consisted of people who would join a king in war. A king didn't rule alone, and the comitatus is where a king's inner circle would be. It would be made up of his family and major landholders within the kingdom. anyone who is wealthy enough to leave the work of handling their land to someone else. There would also be bishops or other religious figures, but it would also be made up of mercenaries who had little to no affiliation to the king and his kingdom. These men would be drawn here primarily to attain wealth and glory. All of these people would have a vested interest in the king doing his job well. A bad king could get any one of them killed, or even worse, taken as a slave. It feels strange for the ownership of the land to be independent of a king's role. To help you understand it, you should imagine a map of land that people owned in Britain. This map would feature hundreds, perhaps thousands, of landowners of varying sizes. Of course, the owners of these lands and their boundaries changed all the time. Marriages, deaths, trading, giving gifts, wars or skirmishes would all result in land changing hands. First, there would be the Kuningers themselves, who would probably be a major landholder. There would be other major landholders as well, who would make up the king's inner circle. These were earls, or noblemen. They would have considerable sway over a king's decisions by virtue of owning large amounts of their kingdom. The rest of the land would be owned by thanes, hundreds of smaller independent landholders. These people would probably not join the king at a seat of government all the time, but would regularly, which we'll get to in a bit. Anyway, layered on top of this map of landowners, we should consider which king these people paid their taxes to. This would be a map of kingdoms. These kingdoms were not fixed in their borders. The borders of kingdoms would change all the time based on the strength and charisma of individual kings, the success of wars, and the loyalty of followers. So we have the landowners and the range of tax collection of kings. There was also a third factor, the identity which people felt. What people felt their identity was could be independent of which king they pay their taxes to. There was no definitive Mercia or Northumbria on a map, but there were Mercians and Northumbrians, and these people could definitely tell you what it was about them which made them feel one way or the other. People may also more feel a regional identity, or feel part of a group that was long ago kingless, or part of an ancestral group, like the Angles, Saxons or Jutes, because identity is complicated like that. As an example, minor kingdoms like the Hwichi were absorbed into Mercia, but this would not remove Hwichi identity. This emphasises the Kun part of a Kuninger's job. He had to unite his kin with his rule. Many contrasting and convoluted identities under the same banner. It's worth emphasising that there was no specific English identity at this time. People in East Anglia would not feel much unity with people in Northumbria or Wessex. And even if someone did, they might not necessarily see this as an identity which means that they should share a king. Anyway, the success or even the survival of a kingdom depended on the strength and charisma of kings. A man who was a poor king would lose followers in his comitatus, and would also lose the support of landowners. This would reduce both his ability to protect and his ability to provide protection, in a spiral until he was removed from his position and replaced by someone else. A string of poor kings would see kingdoms and their identities gradually disappear altogether. This will have happened to countless groups over the 5th to 8th centuries. To name a few examples that we know, this is likely what happened to kingdoms like Middlesex, Sussex and Essex, which were absorbed into Kent, Mercia, East Anglia and Wessex. In turn, in the 8th century, misfortune allowed Kent and East Anglia to become sub-kingdoms of Mercia. There was a lot in that first section of the video, and I'm afraid it doesn't get much easier from here, because not only were kingdoms different in what they were, they're also different in what they were governed like. One of the key differences which we need to emphasise is the relationship that Kuningers had with their kingdoms. We imagine a king living in a central palace, enacting their will on the people, and having taxes brought to them. But in Anglo-Saxon Britain, it was impossible to rule from a palace. The systems to move goods like cattle, or large amounts of manufactured goods from where they were produced to a centre just didn't exist. Therefore, instead of the kingdom coming to a king had to go out to their kingdom. This gave rise to a particular way of life for a king and his comitatus. They were almost nomadic as they travelled around the kingdom. Academics give this the term itinerant kingship. Itinerant means travelling from place to place, so itinerant kingship is a king who rules by travelling around their kingdom. Anglo-Saxon kings would have several royal residences littered around their kingdoms, which they travel between throughout the year. These would change from king to king or over time, as different areas become popular. Let's consider an example. The best known, best preserved and most elaborate one is named Yavering, but is referred to by Bede with the name Adgefren. This was a royal village where a king, first of Bernicia and later probably of Northumbria, would meet his subjects who lived in this area. It was abandoned in the mid-7th century in favour of another nearby site. As a tangent, Adgefren is a Celtic word, meaning Hill of the Goats, a centre of the Kingdom of Bernicia, which itself is also a Celtic name. This was an Anglo-Saxon kingdom, which spoke Old English. This disparity can't be explained through the idea of a violent invasion, so is a piece of evidence that the systems of the kingdom, and the kingdom itself, were co-opted into Germanic culture through assimilation, rather than violently swept away through invasion. This is separate from later times, when relationships between the cultures were more openly hostile. And these later relations between the cultures are what people point to and then impose backwards on this period. Brian Hope Taylor has concluded that in Bernicia, British and Germanic cultures lived side by side. Thinking back to the last section of the video, the landowners within the kingdom were probably a mixture of British and Germanic in culture, and the government of Bernicia probably bore this multicultural mixture in mind when they governed their people. Anyway, a Bernician or Northumbrian king would arrive at Adgefren in the shadow of an Iron Age hill fort, staking claim to the ruins of those that came before to legitimise their rule. And here, he would ceremonially collect his fees from the locals. These would be our earls, who would seek to impress the king with what they could offer, and our thanes, who would join the king while he was in their area. With the goods taken as tax, the king would throw a lavish feast, conspicuous consumption to show off his wealth and status in society. In turn, while here, he would perform his duties. We covered what that meant here, earlier in the video. But for an example, we can turn to Adgefren's catchily named Building E. This was a small stage, surrounded by trenches, for people to sit at. This has been interpreted as a place where a king, or one of his representatives, would read laws, and would make decisions on justice. This stage would be the centre of Bernician or Northumbrian political power in Adgefren. Though we've found no other buildings like it, similar pronouncements were probably made in other kingdoms as well. One of the most puzzling things about Adgefren was the lack of high-value trade goods found there. But we know that this place was only used part-time. It was only one royal centre of many for Bernician and Northumbrian kings as they travelled throughout their kingdom. Other royal sites, like Rendlesham in East Anglia, have been found filled with high-value goods. The name by which Bede described Adgefren is a villa regia, or royal village. Archaeologists have named them a variety of terms: royal township, high status centre, palace, or chiefly farmstead. The term which Matt Austin settles on in his PhD thesis is Great Hall Complex. This communicates that features can vary massively with unique buildings like Building E at Adgefren, but they all have one central feature: the Great Hall. The Great Hall was probably the centre of royal power. These large timber halls are where feasts would be held, and would be where stories, like Beowulf, were told to entertain people. We're told that a desired storyteller's trait was a loud voice, likely to shout over the drunken feasting which went on in these grand buildings. The importance of the hall in the Anglo-Saxon mind is told to us extensively in poetry. In Beowulf, the timber hall Heorot is described as the finest of all buildings. It's associated with life and its pleasantries. It's the best of royal halls, a high hall, wine hall, the gold hall of men. It is furnished with many wondrous sights for each of the men, and it is filled with friends. It represented a circle of light, peace, and everything good in the world, enclosed by darkness, discomfort, and danger of the outside world, filled with war and beasts like Grendel or dragons. This tells us how culturally the hall is tied to elite life at the time. Ardgefren has evidence of many timber great halls which existed and were used over its lifespan. Of these, building A4 was the largest, at 26 metres long and 11 metres wide. As of 2016, there were 16 known or suspected Great Hall complexes. Of our 16 discovered Great Hall complexes, 5 are mentioned in written sources. 53 are mentioned in written sources overall. Using this ratio, Matthew Austin has estimated that there are 150 Great Hall complexes in Britain. We tend to imagine that what I've just outlined is how Anglo-Saxon kings spent their time. That they, as we would today, pored over the details of their kingdom, its economy, and resource extraction to maximise their profits. But one of the most confusing things of all is a mindset that kings had towards ruling their kingdoms. While it was doubtless desirable to be king, as John Blair says, economic development, high politics, or even warfare were not necessarily the recreations of choice. At the same time as these kingdoms emerged, a broader European behaviour occurred which had a particular effect on these Great Hall complexes and where they were located. In late Roman and early medieval Europe, hunting became the main aristocratic recreation. Naomi Sykes notes that in Anglo-Saxon Britain from around the 7th century, venison began to reappear in the archaeological record at elite sites. This tells us that hunting emerged as an activity. Like on the continent, hunting was likely a very important way for royals and nobles to show off their combat readiness. John Blair argues that the adoption of hunting culture changed where royals chose to live. These great hall complexes, he says, were, in most cases, close to what would at the time have been hunting ground. He argues that 3 kingdoms, Northumbria, Wessex and Mercia, have their heartlands near forests where hunting could be exercised. This was also the case for East Anglia at Rendlesham. This paradoxically meant that the places where kings spent the majority of their time was not necessarily a place which made economic or even efficient sense. Kingdoms were strangely warped, as rather than spending their time in the centre, in towns, kings of the 6th to 8th century brought the town to them, on the far periphery of their kingdoms, in comparatively rural locations, places where they could best express their kingliness, not through governing or warfare, but through hunting. What I've outlined in this video is, in some ways, very specific to the 5th to 7th centuries, but in other ways, it's a traditional way to live throughout the Anglo-Saxon period, and it doesn't go away until the Norman invasion. As late as the 10th century, written accounts speak of people coalescing in places where great hall complexes have either been found or would be expected, in the shadow of forests, grand visuals of hunting, and landscapes dotted with prehistoric burial sites. To Anglo-Saxon kings and wider society, this was kingly behaviour. This type of government was a specific response to what people felt was needed at the time. An individual king who could unite previously independent landowners of various cultures and protect them from each other and from other groups. And of course, no king rules forever. At the same time that kings began to develop interesting ways to live, they also developed interesting ways to die. Princely burials began to emerge at the same time. Sites like Sutton Hoo, Prittlewell or Taplow had grand displays of wealth placed specifically for the dead. That's a topic for a later video. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Leave a like and subscribe if you did, and let me know what you think in the comments. Support me on Patreon, on Ko-fi, or become a channel member if you found it especially good. I release videos early for these people. Thanks again.